Imagine being just 17 years old, leaving home without knowing when, or if, you would ever return. Crossing endless deserts, towering mountains and vast empires to reach lands that most Europeans believed existed only in legends. That journey would last 24 years. Many dismissed his stories as fantasy. History remembered him as a legend. Welcome back to Footsteps of the Ancients, where we explore the people, the journeys, and the stories that shaped human history. Today, we journey back to the 13th century to follow a young Venetian, whose extraordinary adventure would become one of the greatest travel stories ever told. Let's follow the incredible journey of Marco Polo, and find out what he really saw. In 1271, near the end of the 13th century, a 17-year-old named Marco Polo lived in the great trading city of Venice, in what is now Italy. From an early age, Marco dreamed of the East. He had grown up listening to stories of magnificent cities, wealthy kingdoms, endless caravans crossing vast deserts, and distant lands that most Europeans knew only through rumors and legends. To him, they were more than stories, they were an invitation. At the age of 17, Marco Polo left Venice with his father and uncle, setting out on a journey that would change his life forever. Following the ancient Silk Road, he traveled farther east than he had ever imagined. He crossed the Middle East, he journeyed through Persia, present-day Iran. He passed the rugged mountains and harsh deserts of Central Asia. Along the way, he joined merchant caravans, endured dangerous roads, and entered lands that few Europeans had ever seen. Year after year, Marco continued east. Then, after a journey that seemed without end, he finally arrived in China. At the time, China had recently undergone a remarkable transformation. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, had completed the conquest of the Song dynasty and founded the Yuan dynasty, uniting China under Mongol rule. The capital of the empire was Dedu, known today as Beijing. When Marco Polo arrived, he entered the court of Kublai Khan. The young Venetian walked slowly through the vast audience hall. Every step brought him closer to the throne of the most powerful ruler on earth. At the end of the hall, Marco bowed before Kublai Khan. According to Marco Polo, the great Khan was deeply curious about the world beyond his empire and welcomed travelers from distant lands to share their stories. The young Venetian soon earned the emperor's confidence. Marco later claimed that Kublai Khan entrusted him with missions that took him across the vast Yuan Empire. Whether every detail of his account is true remains a subject of debate. What is beyond dispute, however, is that Marco spent many years in Yuan China, observing its cities, its people, and its remarkable achievements with his own eyes. One of the most astonishing was paper money. He explained that in China, people did not always rely on gold or silver for trade. Instead, the government issued paper currency, made from the bark of mulberry trees, officially stamped by the state, and accepted throughout the empire. To the Chinese, it was simply part of everyday life. To Europeans of the 13th century, it sounded almost unimaginable. Many dismissed his accounts as fantasy, while others accused him of exaggeration. Yet centuries later, when paper money became an essential part of economies around the world, people realized that Marco Polo had described one of the most sophisticated financial systems of his age. But paper money was only the beginning. Perhaps even more astonishing were his descriptions of Hangzhou, one of the greatest cities in the world at the time. Venice was home to roughly 100,000 people. London had even fewer. Hangzhou, by contrast, may have been home to over 1 million people. Marco described enormous markets, magnificent bridges, canals crowded with boats, and a level of wealth unlike anything he had ever seen. Marco Polo also marveled at the Grand Canal, the vast waterway that connected northern and southern China. Countless boats carried grain, silk, and other goods across the empire every day, creating one of the greatest transportation networks of the medieval world. It was a scale of commerce that Europe could scarcely imagine. Another wonder was Chinese porcelain. Its brilliant white surface, delicate craftsmanship, and remarkable strength were unlike anything made in Europe at the time. To many Europeans, it seemed almost too perfect to have been made by human hands. He also wrote about the extraordinary communication network of the Mongol Empire. Thousands of relay stations stretched across the empire. Couriers rode from one station to the next, changing horses along the way and carrying messages across vast distances with astonishing speed. Then, there was another surprise. A black stone dug from the earth and burned for heat. That black stone was coal. While much of Europe still relied primarily on firewood, coal had already been used extensively in China for centuries. After 17 years in the East, Marco Polo had witnessed one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. Yet there was one thing he longed for above all else: home. And so Marco Polo decided it was finally time to return to Venice. In 1292, the Yuan court entrusted the Polo family with an important mission. They were to escort a young Mongol princess by sea to Persia, where she was to marry a local ruler. It was a rare opportunity, and one that finally allowed Marco Polo to leave the empire he had called home for nearly 2 decades. The fleet sailed through the South China Sea, across Southeast Asia, and into the Indian Ocean before finally reaching Persia. It was a long and dangerous voyage. Storms, disease, and the hardships of life at sea claimed the lives of many who had set sail. After completing the mission, Marco continued his journey back to Europe. In 1295, after 24 years away from home, he finally returned to Venice. The 17-year-old who had left in search of the unknown came home as a man in his 40s. According to a famous tradition, many relatives, and even old friends, refused to believe that the travelers were truly members of the Polo family. To prove their identity, the Polos are said to have cut open their worn, travel-stained clothing, revealing precious gemstones sewn into the fabric. Whether the story is entirely true remains uncertain, but it reflects the extraordinary wealth they had brought back after more than 2 decades in the East. Back in Venice, Marco often shared stories of the remarkable world he had witnessed. Some listened in amazement, others dismissed his accounts as impossible. Life in Venice gradually returned to normal. For Marco Polo, the long journey had finally come to an end. Yet fate had one final chapter waiting for him. During the war between Venice and Genoa, Marco was captured and taken prisoner. Behind prison walls, he recounted the story of his extraordinary journey to a fellow prisoner, the writer Rustichello da Pisa. Together, they turned those memories into a book that would become known as The Travels of Marco Polo. The book spread rapidly across Europe, inspiring generations of explorers, including Christopher Columbus centuries later, and became one of the most influential travel accounts in history. Marco Polo spent the rest of his life in Venice. He died in 1324, at around 70 years of age. According to tradition, even on his deathbed, some people still urged him to admit that he had exaggerated the wonders of the East. He refused. Instead, he is said to have replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." If you visit Venice today, you will still find its canals, bridges, and narrow streets filled with visitors from around the world. It is hard to imagine that more than 7 centuries ago, this beautiful city was the starting point of one of history's greatest journeys. From those canals, Marco Polo traveled all the way to China. More than 700 years later, his journey continues to inspire travelers, explorers, and anyone who wonders what lies beyond the horizon. His story reminds us that the world is often far greater and far more extraordinary than we imagine. And sometimes, a single journey can change not only the traveler, but the way an entire civilization sees the world. What part of Marco Polo's journey surprised you the most? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to Footsteps of the Ancients. One journey ends, another is about to begin. In our next documentary, follow the incredible journey of Ibn Battuta, the man who traveled farther than Marco Polo, and perhaps farther than anyone in the medieval world. Subscribe to Footsteps of the Ancients, and join us for another remarkable journey through history.